Chapter 11 Year 875 PXF Late Spring. A weariness of both body and spirit engulfed Osman. Not the exhaustion of a troubled mind, but the satisfying need for rest well earned. Osman let his consciousness briefly check on Wilfred. He was using the Saldrig's powerful jaws to worry at a femur, cracking it open and enjoying the tender marrow within. With little more than the thought of letting go, the sensation of gently falling floated over Osman, and he found himself back in his room at the Sojourn's Rest, sitting on the edge of his bed. The memory of the hunt remained fresh in Osman's mind, but also seemed dreamlike. Even knowing he was no more than a sentient idea within his and Wilfred's shared mind, he could still feel an ache in his muscles, a fullness in his stomach, and a renewed energy in his soul. At the thought of such corporeal things, Osman longed to see his Uldani body. He had never manipulated the environment of the mindscape before. It had always been Wilfred. Osman concentrated on his body and willed the chrysalis to become visible. It appeared with nothing more than the need he felt to see it. The chrysalis situated itself at the foot of his bed. Standing, he circled the bedpost to look down through the semi-translucent shell at what lay within. No miracles of healing had occurred from the single hunt, but where before his body's lips had been pursed together in a tight line biting back pain, the tension now seemed somewhat eased. Osman patted the chrysalis comfortingly, catching the deep scars on his forearms from the corner of his eye. Both flesh and spirit still had much healing to do, but Osman now understood there was a path forward. With Wilfred's help, he could be whole again. Osman made one last addition to the room in his mind. A small mirror appeared on the wall, and he faced the wraith-like visage of his soul. The deep pits of his eyes that once had been empty of light reflected a tiny spark of joy in the shape of a hare bounding across the snow. With an inward smile that, with his unique perspective, he could genuinely say touched his soul, Osman put himself to bed. Osman's consciousness slipped into a peaceful, meditative, healing sleep. He awoke of his own accord nearly 8 months later, hungry for another taste of life and external activity to stimulate his muscles and senses. Wilfred taught Osman all he had learned about hunting, and after many unsuccessful attempts, Osman finally did catch his first elusive hare. The seasons and years slipped by in the surrounding plains of Kaiflanor. It seemed to be less than a handful of weeks for Osman, as each awakening filled him with the vitality needed to retire to his room and heal his broken soul. 5 years later, 880 PXF. Autumn. Osman awoke invigorated and starving. Sitting up in his familiar bed, he stretched his arms wide and let out an exuberant vocal yawn to shake off the last of his weariness. Osman brought his bare arms down in front of him, laying them parallel to each other above the light quilt covering his legs. Upon waking, he performed a similar ritual to the one he had adopted as a child. He examined the hash-mark scars etched across his forearms that marked his soul. Unlike the marks in the log above his childhood bed, these hashes were changing. While the centers were still not fully closed, their far lengths had become no more than raised silvery scars. Waking up to the marks carved in the log above his bed at Horizon's End had always brought resignation, but these on his forearms now brought him hope. They were healing. He was healing, and he had survived. Osman's hand absently went to his chest, gingerly examining the hole that was still present. Where once there had been only the thinnest filaments of soul flesh, wide bridges now spanned the gaping wound. He could feel the tension in them pulling his soul back together where he had sliced it apart. Osman smiled at the progress he felt under his fingertips and leapt from his bed. His room had changed from the exacting memory of what it had been when Osman lived at the Sojourn's Rest, and while it was still recognizable as that space, Osmond had made a few changes. Most notably, it was bigger, nearly the size of the main room in Talon's suite. The chrysalis remained at the foot of the now larger bed, in the same spot he had summoned it after his first hunt. No longer cramped into the space between the end of the bed and the opposite wall, it now anchored one side of a large sitting area with a comfortable couch and a small carved table in front of it. The table was a twin to what Anson had intricately carved for Tavi's living rooms at Horizon's End. Overlooking the sitting area on what should be the inn's outside wall, the structure's timbers transitioned to the cave wall upon which Tavi had painted the portrait of Osmond. Opposite the image, tucked in the corner but proudly displayed, was a mannequin dressed in Osmond's gala outfit, cycling through its full retinue of seasons and tricks. Other memories adorned the room, across the walls and tucked into corners. His matching swords from Arnador, Alarice's painting of Grimspire, and, near the hearth, the boots gifted him by Lady Courvermain. In an honored position on the mantel, Osmond had placed Talon's iron dagger, a reminder of his Catmalorn. Osmond padded over to the couch on bare feet, his favorite cotton sleeping breeches hem catching on fuller calves whose skin was no longer etched with deep channels and were slowly returning from their desiccated state. A glass of chilled apple juice appeared on Anson's table with a mere thought. While it had no sustenance, it gave Osmond comfort. Another ritual he had adopted akin to Talon and his morning tea. Osmond could sense Wilfred was awake and prowling. With a quick close of his eyes and a deep inhale, Osmond could recognize the smells of approaching winter. He did not pick up a sense of urgency from Wilfred, but there was a purpose behind his movements, and that purpose required him. He finished the apple juice in 3 large gulps while simultaneously standing up. The motion did not culminate in his soul standing in front of the couch in his room, but instead with him looking out of Saldric eyes on the world as he strode along a high snow-covered ledge. "There you are." Wilfred's welcoming voice echoed in Osmond's mind. 4 months. You missed a lovely changing of the leaves. How does boar sound for breakfast? Wilfred recited how long he had slept, any news, and what they were hunting without Osmond needing to ask. Osmond slid easily into control of the Saldric body he and Wilfred shared, and, looking around at the altitude and rocky terrain, stated jokingly, "You're casting your net in the wrong place for boar, old man. We're hunting boar in the morning. Tonight there is other business for you to attend to." Wilfred's tone sounded like Talon's when assigning latrine duty. Directing their eyes to the Solenfell and shifting them to Veilsight, he continued, "It's been stuck like that for days." The scene painted across the sky was immediately familiar. The dining hall of the barracks at Arnador Keep. Osmond could almost smell the miasma of sweat-stained leather armor, weeks-old leftovers, and bodies too long unwashed. Judging by the scant number of guards present at mealtime, the scene was from a time before Talon became Knight Captain. Osmond's eyes slid to a familiar corner, and reaffirming his suspicion, he spotted his younger self. Osmond ate alone at the end of one of the tables, as far from the doors as possible. He sat as an island of one, with the next nearest person nearly half the room away. Upon recognizing himself, the frozen image painted in the sky began to flow forward through time. As he watched, Osmond recalled the din of knives on cheap tin plates playing amongst the ebb and flow of conversations that moved from raucous, empty braggadocio to grumbles of discontent. Caught in his memory as much as he was watching the scene unfold, Osmond saw nothing amiss. However, being tapped into the Saldrig's senses, Osmond became wary as his hackles rose and nerves jangled, registering nearby danger. He scanned the ledge they were on for anything approaching, but quickly ascertained the threat was not to their Saldrig body, but to himself in the image playing across the Solenfell. With eyes locked on the sky, Osmond's bewilderment at what he sensed roused Wilfred. "The image has always remained frozen before, lad. This is new." Wilfred responded in his head. Osmond examined the scene more closely and finally recognized what he was seeing. The guards were eating summer pies, overflowing with ripe fruits of the season. This could only be the night before his promotion and Talon's accepting the role of Knight Captain. Rank-and-file guards never had something so fine as fruit pies, but with the bountiful harvest that year, some local wives brought dozens of them to the keep. As the local women distributed thick slices of pie to the guards, including himself, Osmond spotted what was amiss and had triggered the Saldrig's warning. Watching him out of the corner of her eye from across the mess hall, dressed inconspicuously as a simple laborer, was Serena. Osmond's heart and throat clenched tight as a growling voice, the impression of which he had only once before experienced but never heard, entered his mind.
She eyes you like an ice serpent secreted beneath the snow, waiting to strike.
The voice of the Saldrig. Osmond mentally checked in with Wilfred, but he seemed just as shocked. Osmond returned their gaze to the Solenfell. What he was seeing happened nearly a year before Osmond had met Serena at the gala. It was apparent, however, that she knew who he was, and had ill intent laid out for him. Osmond continued to watch as Serena pulled a pie out of a box separate from the others.
Poison, disease, corruption.
The Saldrig's nostrils flared wide by instinct with neither Osmond's nor Wilfred's volition. Serena followed another pie-carrying local out of the mess hall. They exited through the door leading to the officers' dining room, where Knight Captain LaSalle, Duke's Guard Holden, and the rest of Duke Isul's private regiment were dining. By morning, LaSalle and Holden would be dead, and Talon and Osmond thrust together as Knight Captain and newest member of the Duke's private regiment. The scene within the Solenfell faded, and it returned to its usual ebb and flow across the sky. The implications of all he had seen hit Osmond like a physical blow, and he retreated into his mind. His knees buckled, and he fell heavily back onto the couch as though he had not entirely made it to standing. Osmond sat dumbfounded. A few moments later, Wilfred appeared and sat on the carved table across from him.
It was all a lie. Every moment. From even before I knew she existed, I was just a part of her plan.
Osmond recited the words emotionlessly. Wilfred placed a comforting hand on Osmond's knee, both fully solid to each other in this place.
I'm sorry, lad. I didn't know what the sky held for you. If I did, I would have waited to show you.
Osmond laid his hand on Wilfred's.
It's okay. I needed to see. My heart still held a bit of hope that some of what we had was real. I could never fully accept everything my head knew to be true.
Osmond paused, then continued, almost struggling to say the words.
Now I know.
Osmond doubled over as pain racked his chest. His shoulders heaved as the muscles in his torso clenched. He felt like he was retching, but the spasms weren't coming from his abdomen. They were coming from the wound in his chest. Again and again, his chest muscles cramped and released, threatening to tear open the delicate, still healing tear in his soul. In a panic, Osmond covered the hollow void in his chest with his hands, trying to protect the delicate soul flesh that had taken so long to heal even partially. A horrifying full-body convulsion lurched him forward, chest over knees, pinning his hands between the two. Wilfred flew off the table and knelt at Osmond's side, arm over his shoulders, trying to steady him. Osmond felt something cold and sharp drop into his palm, expelled from his chest. Gasping for breath, he sat back up and looked down at his hands. In his grasp was a shard of black glass, and encased within its crystalline facets was a mortifying, lidless eye, the iris an exact match for Serena's. Startled by the gruesome sight and the manner in which it had arrived in his hand, Osmond reflexively threw the shard to the floor as though it were a scorpion.
What in the nine hells was that?
Wilfred exclaimed as he jumped to his feet. Osmond's arm shot out, grabbing Wilfred before he could approach the black glass, slowly spinning to a stop on the floor.
How is it even real? How is that thing in here?
Osmond wondered aloud. Everything in here was in his mind or a part of his soul. A wave of revulsion roiled in Osmond's throat as the image of the parasite attached to Riken entered his mind. Had Serena put something inside him? She had ample opportunity during all the nights they spent together. This didn't seem as sentient or virulent as the parasite conjured by her uncle. It seemed more like a piece of shrapnel lodged in his soul. Serena even took advantage of the perfect spot and placed it deep within the void where he had carved out the memories of Horizon's End and his father. Osmond slowly rose from the couch and circled to the mantel, giving the black shard lying on the floor a wide berth. There, he firmly grabbed the hilt of Talon's dagger and warily approached the roughly triangular-shaped medallion of black glass. As he got closer, Osmond realized he was mistaken. It was not glass, but a stone similar to the obsidian found in Male Asari. The object on the floor looked like it had been fractured off a larger piece and then crudely shaped into its current form like one would sharpen flint. The result was a polished central face surrounded by dozens of irregular facets. Dropping to one knee and leaning over the jagged crystal, Osmond shuddered, reliving his initial confusion and revulsion. The stone was not translucent, with Serena's eye encased within it. The smooth surface of the main face reflected her lidless eye peering into it from somewhere else, with the irregular facets creating half a dozen smaller eyes circling the prominent central one. Osmond bit back the bile rising in his throat as his mind recoiled from the thought of Serena secreting that aberrant thing within his soul. He raised the dagger and brought it down on the dark talisman staring up at him. He struck not just with his weapon, but with the force of his will that shaped this place. His intent not only to shatter the vile crystal, but to banish it as well. Osmond struck true with Talon's dagger, shattering the stone. The fragments skittered across the floor before quickly dissolving into a fine mist that ignited in white fire from the force of Osmond's will. Osmond hadn't realized he was holding his breath. His eyes rose to Wilfred, who stood slack-jawed beside the couch.
Whale-humping whirlpools. Who would create such a thing?
Wilfred whispered earnestly, still frozen in shock.
What?
Osmond asked, baffled by Wilfred's expletive and failing at holding back the chuckle that rose from his belly.
Really, Wilfred? Whale-humping whirlpools?
Wilfred, trying to remain serious, explained.
They are quite dangerous, actually. You see, the whales...
Wilfred failed to finish his thought, unable to hold his stoic demeanor any longer. Osmond raised up off his one knee and crossed to Wilfred, where they both flopped down on the couch side by side, chuckling. Simultaneously, their stomachs growled, and both felt a deep hunger in their bones.
That's not just us,
Osmond stated matter-of-factly.
And what was that with the Saldrig's voice? I thought the Saldrig body was just a manifestation of my body protecting itself.
Osmond looked to the chrysalis across from him at the foot of the bed.
I've no idea. Perhaps it was due to the message from the Solenfell. Or something else entirely,
Wilfred conjectured.
Once we get you healed up, we can explore more of what it means to channel the souls of beasts. But first, breakfast,
they said in unison, and in a blink, they both were looking out the eyes of the Saldrig still standing stoically on the high ledge looking out at Solenfell, which was becoming washed out in the light of sunrise.
Bore, you say?
Osmond asked Wilfred internally, as they leapt down from the ledge, descending to the boreal forest below.
Gods, I miss bacon.
With the expulsion of Serena's talisman from his soul, Osmond's recovery quickened. But even with the accelerated rate, souls do not mend themselves overnight. With each awakening, Osmond grew stronger, and soon he was spending whole days in control of the Saldrig, instead of just having the stamina for one hunt and then returning to unconsciousness within his mindscape. Wilfred's presence was always near when Osmond needed him, whether for rest or company. As Osmond became more self-sufficient, though, he could tell Wilfred was finally taking the time to do some healing of his own and address the demons he carried with him from his living life. Time winked by, coalescing quickly into years. Likewise, Osmond's days as the Saldrig turned to weeks, then months, his recovery becoming a more active endeavor instead of passive bed rest. The voice of the Saldrig never spoke again, but as Osmond's time immersed in the beast's form grew longer, he found rest in letting his mind fade into the Saldrig's primal thoughts and instincts, recognizing him as an individual and not just a form Osmond wore. During those times, he would become fully one with the Predator, nearly forgetting an Uldani named Osmond ever existed. Osmond's body in the chrysalis was healing, but was also going through a metamorphosis of its own, the full extent of which Osmond could only vaguely identify. Looking down through the translucent surface, Osmond could see his body was whole again. If anything, it looked more hale and hearty than it had ever been. Still barely covered in the scant strips of remaining clothing that survived after facing the serpent's breath, his body was thicker with muscle than ever before, and when comparing it to the painting of himself on the cave wall in his room, it seemed more than a few inches taller as well. The strangest part, however, was when he reached out his consciousness to what should be its rightful place. A slight pressure always pushed him away. It almost seemed to say, "Not yet." Headstrong as Osmond was, he had once tried to force his way through the barrier, curiosity and longing pushing him forward. As he did, his mind brushed against his body's senses. Instantly, it felt like 1,000 acid-covered briars raked across every inch of his soul. Osmond yanked himself back from the shock and pain of it, but in that instant of contact, he recognized the senses in his body were not the same as the person he once was. 4 years later, 884 PXF. Spring. The Saldrig prowled through dawn's early hours, the cacophony of emerging life filling his senses. The unending darkness of winter had broken, and the pent-up energy of the long night had burst forth with unbridled exuberance for the season of rebirth. The Saldrig had kept himself well fed through the winter on the old and unfirm, culling the weak, but spring held the promise of the succulent flesh of youth and easy kills. The Predator was not tracking his next kill this morning, however. He had had his fill on a flick of 36 hares, halving their number the evening before. The Saldrig was following Curiosity through the early morning light. Curiosity was a strange concept for the Saldrig. He had no need to care about things that entered his territory that were not for sustenance or challenged his dominance. However, the scent he followed was important and familiar, even though the Saldrig knew he had never encountered prey of its like before. The Saldrig slowed his pace and crouched low to the ground, creeping forward, ears resting flat against his head. His quarry was just ahead. This creature was wily. It had masked its scent within a field of bright yellow, newly bloomed daisies, where it now squatted low to the ground, back turned to the Saldrig's approach. The strange creature's slow, steady heartbeat began to thrum through the Saldrig, eliciting a flow of saliva into his mouth. Perhaps a morning meal would be nice after all. Jaws open, ready to lunge forward to make a quick kill and a tasty morsel of the plump creature, the Saldrig crept closer. Quick as a viper, the creature spun around and swatted the Saldrig across his tender nose with a willow switch.
"Stop being ridiculous,"
Alaris the Bloom Sage chided. The Saldrig leapt back, like a kitten encountering its first cricket, instead of the over 800 pounds of muscle, fangs, and claws he truly was. The startled shock of the Saldrig brought Osmond's mind to the foreground, no longer submerged in the instincts of the beast he wore.
"Oh,
Alaris exclaimed.
It's you, Osman. And look, you have a new costume to wear, just like the ones you made as a child to play pretend. How nice.
Alaris's demeanor was almost giddy, unlike the sage and timeless mystery they had radiated in late summer at Horizon's End. It was as though the energy of emerging spring had infected them as much as it had all of nature around them. Alaris continued, paying no mind that they spoke to a Saldrig that loomed before them and could strike them down instantly.
Now take that off and come greet me properly.
They waved their tiny hands, summoning Osman closer.
Don't be shy now. Come along.
Osman didn't know how to react. While his body in the chrysalis appeared healed, he had not attempted to re-enter it after encountering the excruciating pain of his still-developing nervous system. Wilfred was suddenly with him, sharing his consciousness but not assuming control. They both hesitated, flabbergasted.
That's okay. You can bring your friend, too,
Alaris invited genially. Osman, not knowing how to proceed, hesitated. The Bloom Sage's voice snapped out like a whip, patience having faded.
Osman, come here.
It was not a request or even a command, but a tectonic imperative that moved Osman to obey without thought. The giant Saldrig padded forward and bowed his head. The Bloom Sage reached out their hands and brought the beast's head, nearly as large as their whole body, to their own. Atop a slight rise in a field of dark-eyed, golden-petaled daisies, the sun rising behind them, where once there was the silhouette of a mighty predator bowed over a tiny figure before it, now stood Osman, an Uldani man once again, forehead pressed together with Alaris.
Ah, there you are,
said Alaris as they stepped back and looked over Osman from head to toe.
With all the holes mended back as they should be.
They absent-mindedly added with a hint of an unsettling cackle.
I never did like cheese with holes.
Osman held his hands before him, rotating them in dawn's light, examining his true flesh that now seemed so unfamiliar. He felt vulnerable and exposed, experiencing the material world in his Uldani form without the claws and fangs he had grown accustomed to. Osman flexed fleshy, clawless fingers and ran his tongue across teeth that were mere nubs. His senses were muffled whispers compared to the Saldrig. Simultaneously, he felt his soul expanding and flowing into the extents of a body not entirely the same as when he last inhabited it. Confirming his observations from outside the chrysalis, his lithe, flexible muscles, so suited for his acrobatic prowess, now bulged with a thickness and strength they never previously possessed. From the perspective change he was experiencing, Osman also estimated he was at least 4 or more inches taller than he had been. He felt like he was standing on the dais where the tailors had fitted his Blossom Gala outfit, even though his boots were firmly on the ground. At the fleeting thought of his gala attire and wondering if it would still fit, or any of his clothes for that matter, Osman recognized his current state. He wore his enchanted boots that were none the worse for the wear. However, the same could not be said for the rest of his clothing. The Guardian of the Inception's breath had ravaged them. Tattered breeches barely covered his thighs, the remains held up by his belt, which miraculously remained serviceable, unlike the remainder of his tunic and jerkin, which fell to the ground as a pile of rags upon his inspection. The bare blade of Talon's iron dagger was shoved into his belt. However, Osman could feel an unnatural chill flowing off it through his ragged breeches as it pressed against his hip. As he became reacquainted with his Uldani body, Osman began to notice the most significant change. The loss of the Saldrig's superior senses had masked the difference from him initially, but he now recognized that every one of his Uldani senses was more acute than what they had been or naturally should be. Osman could feel the vibrations of a mole burrowing through the rich soil under his feet, even through the soles of his boots. On the wind, he detected whispers of musk off a young male fox looking for a mate in the trees to the north. His eyes spotted details of bumblebums half an acre away sipping nectar in the field of black-eyed daisies. As Osmond drank in the world, emotions flooded out of his soul, bringing with them all the keel his Uldani heritage gifted him. Wonder tickled between his toes. Relief kissed his fingertips as gently as butterfly wings. Joy bounced in his stomach, and the dozens of little emotions that expressed themselves across his face danced there once again.
You cared for him well, Guide of the Guardian,
Alaris stated, eyes shifting off Osmond for the first time. In the overwhelming distraction of returning to his proper form, Osmond's mind had yet to consider Wilfred. His incorporeal form stood just behind and to the side of Osmond, his springtime green aura still shining brightly.
Wilfred!
Osmond exclaimed, the name tumbling awkwardly out of his mouth as he reacquainted himself with an unfamiliar tongue and lips. Unable to find all the words he wanted to say, Osmond spread his arms wide and presented himself like a child showing off a new toy to a doting elder, and repeated,
Wilfred!
He filled the name with all the gratitude, excitement, and uncertainty-filled wonder he felt.
Aye, you pulled yourself back together quite nicely,
Wilfred observed proudly.
Looks like a bit of our Saldrig friend rubbed off on you in the process.
Osmond went to hug Wilfred, and his friend's arms even came up to meet him, but a pained look crossed Wilfred's face, matching the disappointing ache Osmond felt in his heart, as they both realized they were no longer in the mindscape and could no longer touch.
So what happens now? Will we ever be...
Osmond waved his hand vaguely at his head, continuing,
Like that again? Together? I don't rightly know, lad,
Wilfred confessed.
But I know I won't be going with you any further on this journey,
he continued, looking abashedly.
I also had an arrangement with the Guardian. Guide of the Guardian.
Osmond intuited Wilfred's words in the familiar way their conversations had gone for over a decade.
What's it mean? To remain this.
Wilfred motioned to himself.
Not a Willoco outside of the stones. I bound myself to the Guardian and the land, to guide others in need as they traverse Caiflinor. My sole condition was that I would not agree unless my first duty was to see you whole again.
Osmond smiled a huge, toothy grin, eyes damp with emotion, now wanting to embrace his friend more than ever.
Wilfred, I am so grateful and so happy for you. I can think of no one better for the job.
Wilfred scratched the back of his neck as he said,
Well, it's a pretty sure bet there will never be someone quite like you again, soul channeler.
Osmond spotted Wilfred's desire to elbow him in the side, as they used to when sitting side by side on the couch in his mind.
Speaking of which, I have a gift for you.
Wilfred motioned for Osmond to bend down and bring his face closer to his own, no longer able to simply reach up to it with Osmond's now taller form. Osmond dropped to one knee instead, reminiscent of the first morning in the camp when he thought he was saying goodbye. Osmond felt the slightest tingle where their foreheads touched, and the door to shared memory opened between them. In the memory, the Saldrig's veil site revealed the spirit of a huge mist owl, its silver-gray feathers rippling in the moonlight. The owl's contemplative saucer eyes and masked face looked up to the Saldrig sitting on its haunches. The wizened owl cocked its head to one side, as if listening to some unseen advisor. Then, with an extended blink and a single flap of its silent wings, it rose into the sky, leaving behind a single ghostly feather. Wilfred contemplated the feather as Osmond had done with the stag's antler. Within it, he saw the entirety of the owl's life, absorbed its essence into himself, and now shared that wisdom with Osmond. Osmond felt the mist owl's memory take its place next to the Saldrig and the caribou stag in the landscape of his mind. Osmond opened his eyes. Wilfred looked back at him, expression full of sorrowful pride, telegraphing the goodbye that was fast approaching.
Lad, Even if we're apart, it doesn't mean we aren't still connected,
Wilfred said sagely as Osmond's eyes grew damp.
We have shared far too much for our souls not to remain entangled. I will be there for you if the need is great enough. I'm not sure where I need to go.
Osmond looked from Wilfred back to Alaris.
All I know is my father left the Argesian Inception with the crystal containing Riken and headed west.
Osmond added,
And he didn't return to Horizon's End until I was 14, almost 7 years after he left in the middle of the night.
During Wilfred and Osmond's reunion, Alaris had taken out their quill and a tiny canvas. They spoke without breaking the rhythm of their scratching away at their painting.
If the Guardian cleansed the boy's soul for reincarnation, Tavi would next need to visit the Eurycean Inception to invoke the living fires of rebirth and the earthen foundations of a new life.
Alaris glanced to the far horizon, where Osmond's enhanced sight could pick up a sliver of the shimmering sea.
Morna Seren is where your path lies.
But how?
Osmond looked around, spotting Grimspire far in the distance to the northeast. Realizing he was on the opposite end of Kaiflanor, he stated,
Volgendeep is half a year's journey away on foot. Even as a Saldrig, it would be autumn before I arrived, and by then there will be no boats for hire.
Osmond added,
And that's if I could even turn myself back to this form without your help.
Osmond, even as a child, you made the simple things difficult,
Alaris chided.
Becoming is just a matter of seeing what you want to be.
With a self-amused chuckle, they continued,
For you, that is just a bit more literal than most, both in the seeing and the becoming.
The quill, paintbrush, and canvas disappeared into one of Alaris's many pockets.
But you must remember, all change comes with a cost. Sometimes just the food in your belly, other times something more. Regarding how you will get to Morna Seren, it is time to spread your wings, even if they are borrowed ones,
Alaris added sagely. The full implication of Wilfred's gift dawned on Osmond. With an exuberance akin to his 6-year-old self and keel-filled toes about to dance out of his boots, he exclaimed,
I can fly! I'm going to fly! Calm yourself, lad,
Wilfred said through a grin.
You won't have me there to guide you, but the owl's instincts will be. She knows the skies like I know the sea. Let her be your guide.
Osmond's growing excitement to take to the air whisked away the sadness of his looming departure and leaving Wilfred behind. He looked to Alaris and asked,
Do you think I'm ready? I feel like there is so much more I should know about what I've become.
I don't have your answers, just like I didn't have them at Horizon's End.
They added prophetically,
None of us understand all we need to know about ourselves or what we are capable of when we start the journey. The only certainty of life is that it must be lived to discover all it can be.
Osmond looked to the 2 timeless Uldani who had so changed his life, one setting his feet upon the path, the other guiding and nurturing him across Kaiflanor to become the man he was now. The familiar keel of loneliness spread through Osmond's back teeth, even though Wilfred and Alaris were still in arm's reach.
I'm right here,
Wilfred mouthed silently, tapping his temple. Alaris picked a palm-sized, dark-eyed daisy and handed it to Osmond along with a platinum coin.
For the Fate Singer's blessing, and clothes when you get to Luminaria. The rest is up to you.
Osmond blushed, reminded of his near-nakedness. He took a deep breath and, with eyes on Wilfred, drew forth the memory of the Mist Owl. Osmond felt his soul inhale away from his Uldani flesh and flow into the foreign avian shape of the Mist Owl. An airy lightness came over Osman as his bones became hollow and his arms lengthened into wings. Avian talons sprang from his feet, more wicked than Saldric claws. The Mist Owl's hearing and vision blasted Osman's mind with their overwhelming sensitivity. Osman tried to take a step forward, but immediately stumbled. Wilfred, bent only slightly to be eye to eye with Osman's stately Mist Owl form, advised,
Osman, let the owl take you home. She's from Mornaserin. She knows the way.
Osman projected the concept of home to the Mist Owl and relaxed his mind to let the instincts of the owl take control. With a powerful stroke of her wings, they took to the air. Osman couldn't help but let out a whoop of delight as the owl circled over the two small figures in the field of yellow daisies, and then headed west.